Chapter 25. The Execution. I eased back on the bed, resting my head on a pillow. Stasha did the same, placing her head on my chest, and I wrapped my arms around her. We stayed that way the whole time, totally quiet. I kept my gaze glued to my watch above Stasha's stomach. Even though it couldn't be possible, with each second that ticked by, the knots in my stomach tied together. Exactly an hour later, the door opened and 3 boys in suits with metal baseball bats came in. "Time to head to the Middleton Township Park," the tallest and biggest of the group said with a cruel grin. 2 black death robes lay draped over one of his burly arms. But first, he dropped the robes on the floor in front of Stasha and me. Hollowness sifted through me as Stasha and I put the robes on over our clothes, then followed the group of guards out of the room, down a side staircase, into the grand entrance room, and out the tall double front doors. 2 of the Bat Boys and one of the gunmen walked behind us, the other gunman and the Bat Boy in front. Though the late fall frigid air cut through me and made me shiver, the sun beamed down. If only it had burned me to death. That way, I wouldn't have to deal with the terrible, painful fates of Stasha, me, and maybe even the rest of the town if Marv hadn't survived his run past the fence. Or if he had, wasn't able to find a way to get everybody to the mansion before the invasion. At least the invasion was a whole hour away. The guards led us through the potholed streets of the suburbs, and my body, my soul, went numb. This would most likely be the last time I'd ever walk these roads. We passed cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac, and I looked at each sagging faction house with its chipped paint and emaciated shrubbery as if it was my own, and I were looking at it for the first time. We entered the much narrower, pebblestone trail of Middleton Township Park. Tall, thin, white birch trees lined the path on the right. A pond spilled to the left, though instead of the water being a still blue-green color, I imagined it a dark red, full of the blood of all the citizens of Middleton, including mine, Stasha's, and our kids. I shuddered so hard it shook my whole body. Past the pond, we walked onto what used to be a football field back in the old world. A sea of flags, 312 to be exact, 1 for each faction, had been anchored into the grass. Beneath them, underground, lay the bodies of generations of kids whose lives had been cruelly stolen by the plague and the Bottolux family. A huge mass of kids had gathered in front of the flags and extended as far as I could see. The citizens of Middleton, eager to watch the so-called ultimate disgraces be brutally dragged by horses before they were hanged to death. I skimmed the crowd. As I expected, 2 large brown stallions stood off to the side. A patrol officer sat on each. My stomach churned, and I barely stopped myself from spewing vomit for the 3rd time in the past hour. As if the thought of Stasha's and my horrendous deaths wasn't enough, an even worse one entered my head. It had only been an hour since Marv escaped the mansion's property, if he actually had. He might have had enough time to show the evidence to our faction, but definitely not to any other factions, since the mansion's news deliverers must have already been out telling everybody about the hangings. Would have been too risky for Marv himself to spread the info, and the news deliverers would have been the fastest to do that anyway. And all that being said, no way our faction would be able to take out all these gunmen and bat-wielding guards on its own. I lowered my head and stared at the ground, my soul deadened. It was really all over. A few more kids decked out in the mansion guard suits stood on a small stage at the edge of the crowd. They didn't carry any bats, so were probably more mansion gunmen for extra security. I remembered the first time I saw the stage, which had been brought there when the Bottolux family took over Middleton. It was my first year in my faction, my first flag day. The rulers stood on the stage like they did every year, and raised the flag of the faction that won the Tournament of Prestige for all to see. In my Nurture faction, I'd learned that people used to perform shows on stages, so all I could think about during the ceremony was what those shows were like, what types of costumes people wore, and how much fun it'd be to watch the performance. Despite the awful situation, my imagination still ran wild. Murmurs broke out from the crowd as Stasha and I approached. They turned into boos that grew so loud the Middleton rulers could probably hear them inside the manor. If I'd had even a last shred of hope, it had been ripped away. Clearly the crowd wanted to see us dead, so Marv must have not been successful. Not in time to save Stasha and me, anyway. We climbed the stage along with the Bat Boys and gunmen, and stood still. I couldn't help but notice both our legs shivered as if layers of ice encased them. I thought about giving her the warmest, encouraging look I could muster, a look that said everything would somehow be all right. But I didn't even have the energy for that, not to mention any true hope for it. On the ground in front of us lay our faction's flags, both complete with red and white stripes and a small blue box full of stars. I had no idea what any of the designs meant, but on each flag a series of names had been scrawled on the stripes in small print. The names of the kids of the faction that had won the Tournament of Prestige in the past. Mine had only 10, crammed into the red stripe on the top, so my faction won only once. I knew that, of course. Stasha's had what looked to be about 20 names spread out on 2 separate stripes, so her faction must have won twice. 2 basketball hoops, the kind with plastic stands on the bottom, stood at the stage behind us. Must have been erected just for this occasion. A looped rope dangled from each of their rims where our corpses would hang after the horse drag. A barrage of chills rolled down my spine, and I wrapped my arms around myself. A girl in a suit who looked about our age stood in front of us. She raised her hand and everybody went silent. I stared out at the ocean of kids in their layers of scraggly clothes. A couple patrol factions, about 24 officers or so total, stood in front of the row with their crinkled old-world police uniforms as their top layer, probably to keep the crowd from surging forward to kill Stasha and me out of rage before we were even executed. "As you all remember from Flag Day," the suited girl said, her breath billowing out in a cloud in front of her thanks to the cold late fall day, "the Middleton rulers are, unfortunately, too sick to host any ceremonies, so I will be your host again." She closed her eyes and lowered her head. "May the rulers pass on peacefully and painlessly." "May the rulers pass on peacefully and painlessly," the crowd murmured like a religious chant. Clearly it still revered the leaders, even more confirmation of our defeat. "As you are also aware," the girl continued, her voice as cold and numb as I felt, "these 2 criminals have committed the most severe violation of all. They broke into the Battlelux family's mansion. Not only that, they damaged some of its property. Because of such horrific acts, we will taint their faction's flags with their foul blood, drag them behind horses until they die, and hang their corpses." The crowd cheered so loudly the stage shook beneath my feet. Tears stung my eyes. They hated us. They hated us so much, and yet we tried to do so much for them. And they'd all die right after us anyway, when the other towns attacked, unless Marf was still alive and got them to overtake the mansion after the ceremony. Please, Power, tell me there'll be enough time. I scanned every row of the crowd, but Marf wasn't in sight. He'd been shot after all. A coldness that had to be more freezing than bathing in the park's pond for an hour straight soaked through me. My best friend gone, and soon Stasha and I would join him. Same with everybody else in an hour. It wasn't like I could even tell all of them about the invasion. No way they'd believe me. The girl waited until the cheers died down, then removed a knife from her pocket and stepped up to me. Its blade glinted in the late morning sunlight. "We'll begin with the tainting of the flags. Hold out your hand, Gorin of Faction 235. I gritted my teeth and held it out over my faction's flag. This would be the easiest of everything to come. But before the girl could bring the blade to my skin, a familiar high-pitched voice cried, "Now!" "Marf, but how?" The front line of the crowd, the 24 patrol officers, surged forward. They pulled their guns from their holsters, and thunderous shots echoed. A couple black-suited mansion guards at the front of the crowd slumped and fell as bullets struck them. The other guards withdrew their guns and fired back at the patrol officers. Marf's scrawny figure appeared in an opening between patrol officers, a black gun in his hand. He must have been behind the row of the officers, who'd completely hidden his small body. I grabbed the announcer's hand that held the knife and tried to pry it from her, but she seized it with both hands and wrenched it out of my grip. She kicked my legs out from under me. I fell to the ground with a loud thud. Pain stung my back. Deafening gunshots continued to ring out. Bodies hit the stage floor all around me and vibrations pulsed through me. The girl wound back the knife and hurled it at my chest. I threw my arm up, which caught the underside of the blade. The knife twirled off behind me and clattered to the ground. She pulled a handgun from her pocket and pointed it at me. I shut my eyes.